She had been gone for 211 days. Not missing. Gone, the way a name disappears from a guest list, the way a chair gets pushed back in at a table and nobody remembers who used to sit there. 211 days of silence, and then, on a wet Tuesday evening in Seoul, the arrival doors at Gimpo International Airport slid open, and Dae-hyun Seo, a man who controlled more wealth than some countries, a man whose name made grown executives lower their voices, forgot how to breathe. Because there she was. Amara Okafor. Alive. Upright. Walking toward him with a slow, careful gait that only pregnant women walk with, one hand resting low on her stomach as if she were holding something more fragile than a child, holding a decision she hadn't fully made yet. He did not call out her name. He did not run to her. For 3 full seconds, the most powerful man in the Seo family stood frozen in an airport arrivals hall, 40 white and crimson roses trembling in his grip, watching the impossible walk toward him in flat shoes and a gray coat 2 sizes too big to hide what could no longer be hidden. Then she stopped 6 feet away. Not close enough to touch. Close enough to see her face and understand, immediately, that this was not a joyful reunion. Her eyes were dry. Her jaw was set. And when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the warmth he remembered. "You shouldn't have come." That was the first sentence. That was how it began. Not with an embrace. Not with tears. With a warning. Before we go further into what happens next, and trust me, what happens next will make your jaw drop more than once, tell me something. Where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Drop your city down in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you haven't already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss where this one goes, because it does not end where you think it ends. Okay. Let's get back into it. Dae-hyun's hand loosened around the roses without him deciding to loosen it. One stem slipped free and hit the polished floor with a soft, papery sound. Then another. Then the whole bouquet, 40 roses meant for a different woman entirely, collapsed at his feet in a heap of red and white. Amara. Her name came out of him like something that had been locked in his chest for 211 days and had finally found the door. You're... His eyes dropped helplessly to the curve beneath her coat. "You're pregnant." "I'm aware," she said. Flat. Guarded. A woman who had rehearsed this moment so many times in her head that the real version came out sounding almost bored, almost rehearsed itself, except her hands, he noticed, were shaking. "Is it?" He stopped himself. Made himself ask it properly, because some questions deserved to be asked with a full mouth and a steady voice, even when the voice wasn't steady at all. "Is the baby mine?" Something in her expression cracked, just barely, just at the edges, like ice under a boot. "You lost the right to ask me that 7 months ago." He flinched like she had hit him. "I don't understand." "No," she said quietly. "You wouldn't." And that was when Dae-hyun noticed the man standing 3 feet behind his own shoulder. His head of personal security, a man named Jung who had worked for the Seo family for 11 years and had never once interrupted Dae-hyun mid-sentence, mid-anything, in all that time. Jung leaned in now, voice pitched low enough that only Dae-hyun could hear it. "Sir, there's a problem." Dae-hyun didn't take his eyes off Amara. "Not now." "Sir, it's about her." Jung's eyes flicked, just once, toward Amara's passport, still clipped to the boarding folder in the immigration officer's hand 15 feet away. Her passport was flagged before the flight landed. Someone entered a hold on her file 6 hours ago. That got Dae-hyun's attention. He turned, slowly, the way a man turns when the ground has just shifted slightly beneath him. "Flagged by whom?" "We don't know yet." Jung's jaw tightened. "But sir, nobody flags a passport that fast unless they already knew she was on that plane." Dae-hyun looked back at Amara. She hadn't heard the exchange, but she had watched his face change, and something in her own expression sharpened, not surprise. Recognition. As if some small, cold part of her had expected exactly this. "They knew you were coming," he said slowly. "Before you landed. Someone knew." "Of course they did," Amara said, and for the first time there was something raw underneath the ice in her voice. Not fear exactly, but the exhaustion of a woman who had stopped being surprised by betrayal a long time ago. "That's the only reason I'm standing here instead of on a plane back to Lagos right now." "Amara." He said her name again, softer this time, stepping closer despite every instinct in her body visibly telling her to step back. "Talk to me." Please. I have spent 7 months turning this city upside down looking for you. I have spent 7 months not sleeping, not. I need you to understand that I never. I need you to understand, she cut in, and her voice finally broke, just slightly, just enough to reveal the woman underneath the armor, that I sent you a message the night before I disappeared. I told you everything. I told you I was scared. I told you what I'd found. I begged you to call me back within the hour, or I was leaving the country. Her eyes glistened, furious and wet at once. You never answered. Dae-hyun's whole body went still. I never received a message from you. Not that night. Not any night after that. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Rain kept falling outside the glass wall of the terminal, streaking silver under the runway lights, and somewhere behind them a departures board clicked over to a new gate number, indifferent to the two people standing in the middle of the busiest airport in Seoul, staring at each other like survivors of two entirely different wars who had just discovered they'd been fighting the same one. You're lying, Amara whispered. But there was no conviction in it anymore. Only the beginning of doubt, the first crack in a wall she had spent 7 months building brick by brick, day by day, city by city, convincing herself that the man in front of her had chosen his family's empire over her and their unborn child. I have never lied to you, Dae-hyun said. Not once. Not about anything that mattered. Then where were you? Her voice rose now, sharp enough that a few passers-by glanced over before hurrying on, the way people in airports always do, curious, but never curious enough to stop. Where were you when I needed you to pick up the phone? Where were you when a car showed up outside my apartment with a driver who had your family's crest on his lapel pin, telling me I needed to leave Seoul within 48 hours or things would get, his words, complicated? Dae-hyun felt something go cold in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since the year his parents died. Nobody in my family sent a car for you. I would know. Would you? Amara's laugh was short, humorless, more like an exhale than a sound of amusement. Because I have spent 7 months believing you sent that car yourself. I have spent 7 months believing that you got what you wanted, an heir, off the books, no complications, no scandal, and that the moment I stopped being useful to you, I stopped existing. That's not, Dae-hyun's voice cracked, actual pain bleeding through the polished, practiced calm that had carried him through boardrooms and funerals and every disaster his family had ever survived. Amara, that is not who I am. That was never who I was with you. Then who sent the car, Dae-hyun? She was crying now, openly, angrily, one hand pressed protectively over her stomach as if she could shield the baby from the conversation itself. Who opened a bank account in my name and put money into it that I never asked for? Who had access to your family's authorization codes, codes that only 6 people on this entire earth are supposed to have, and used one of them to order my relocation like I was a piece of furniture being moved out of a house? Every question landed on him like a slow, deliberate blow, and with each one Dae-hyun felt the floor of his own certainty giving way beneath him, because he realized, with a horror that curled cold through his stomach, that he did not have an answer to a single one of them. I didn't know any of this, he said, and his voice had dropped to something almost like a whisper. I swear to you, on everything I have left, I did not know. Then someone else did, Amara said. Someone close enough to you to have your codes. Someone who wanted me gone badly enough to build an entire fake reality just to make sure I left believing it was you who wanted me gone. They stood in silence again. Around them, the airport kept moving, suitcases rolling, families reuniting, a child laughing somewhere near the baggage carousel, oblivious to the quiet devastation happening 6 feet from the arrivals gate. Dae-hyun looked at her, really looked at her, the tired lines under her eyes that hadn't been there 7 months ago, the careful, protective way she held herself, the wariness that had replaced the woman who used to laugh at him for being too serious, who used to tell him, unprompted, unafraid, exactly when he was wrong. Why did you come back? He finally asked. If you believed all of that, why come back to the one city, the one man you thought had done this to you? Amara's hand tightened over her stomach. Because there are complications. With the pregnancy. My doctor in Lagos said the specialists I need are here, and only here, and I was not going to let my fear of you cost this baby her life. Her eyes met his, hard and unflinching. I'm not here for you, Dae-hyun. I'm here for her. The moment I'm cleared to fly, I am leaving, and you are never going to see either of us again. Please don't say that. I mean it. I don't want your money. I don't want your car. I don't want your protection. Each refusal came out clipped, deliberate, a wall being rebuilt in real time right in front of him. The last time I trusted your protection, Dae-hyun, I disappeared for 7 months and everyone I loved believed I had simply run away. Let me help you anyway, he said. Not because I want something from you. Because I owe you that much, at minimum, whether you believe I'm responsible or not. She studied him for a long moment, long enough that he began to hope, just slightly, that some small ember of the woman who used to trust him was still burning somewhere underneath all that armor. You can drive me to the hospital, she said finally, each word measured, reluctant. That's all. Not your house. Not your protection detail. A car, to a hospital, and then you leave me alone. Done, he said instantly, before she could reconsider. They had barely stepped toward the exit doors when Amara's phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She pulled it free, glanced at the screen, an unlisted number, no name, and something in her face changed, the wariness sharpening into something closer to dread. Who is it? Dae-hyun asked. I don't know. She hesitated, then answered, pressing the phone to her ear. Hello. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then a voice, low, male, deliberately distorted, the kind of voice that had clearly been altered specifically so it could never be traced or recognized in a courtroom. You should have stayed in Lagos. The line went dead. Amara's hand dropped, the phone slipping from her fingers, caught only inches from the ground by Dae-hyun's quick reflexes. Her face had gone pale, the earlier anger replaced by something rawer, more frightened. Amara. He gripped her shoulders gently, forcing her to look at him. Who was that? I don't know, she whispered. But whoever it is, they knew I was going to be standing exactly here, exactly now. Dae-hyun's mind raced through every possibility, every enemy his family had accumulated over 3 generations of quiet, ruthless business, and none of it explained the precision of what had just happened. A flagged passport minutes before landing, a threatening call timed to the second she cleared customs. Someone was watching. Someone had been watching for a long time. Come with me, he said, his voice hardening now, the businessman replacing the wounded man for just a moment. Not to my house. To the hospital like you asked. But I'm not leaving your side until I understand who did this, to both of us. Amara looked at him, torn between 7 months of carefully built distrust and the very real fear now curling through her chest. Finally, she gave the smallest nod. Fine, she said. But this doesn't mean I forgive you. I'm not asking you to, Dae-hyun said quietly. I'm asking you to let me find out who tried to destroy us both. 7 months earlier, before any of this, before the flagged passport, before the disconnected phone call, before 40 roses hit an airport floor, Dae-hyun Seo had been, by every outward measure, untouchable. He ran a private investment network so vast and so quiet that most of Seoul's financial elite didn't fully understand its reach, inherited through 3 generations of a family that had learned, long ago, that true power never needs to raise its voice. People feared him not because he threatened them. He never had to. His silence did the threatening for him. And then there was Amara. She had walked into his life at a charity gala neither of them particularly wanted to attend, the daughter of a Nigerian father and a Korean mother, raised between Lagos and Busan, brilliant and unimpressed by titles in a way that unsettled him immediately, because nothing in his adult life had ever refused to be impressed by him. She told him, within the first 10 minutes of meeting him, that his tie was crooked and that he looked like a man who hadn't laughed in a decade. She was right on both counts. Within a year, she had become the only person on earth who could make him laugh, the only person who dared tell him when he was wrong, the only person he trusted with the parts of himself he kept hidden even from his own family. Their relationship existed almost entirely in private, dinners in unmarked restaurants, weekends in cities where nobody recognized his face, phone calls that stretched past midnight for no reason except that neither of them wanted to be the one to hang up first. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, Amara sat across from him at breakfast, pushed her coffee cup aside, and told him she was pregnant. Dae-hyun did not say anything for almost a full minute. Amara later told him it was the longest silence of her life. And then he had reached across the table, taken both her hands in his, and said the sentence that would haunt every scene that came after it. Our child will never grow up wondering whether I wanted them. He meant it. He meant it with every part of himself that still remembered what it felt like to be a child in that family, waiting for a father too consumed by empire building to look up from his desk. He had promised himself, long before Amara, that if he ever had a child, that child would never know that particular kind of hunger. 3 days later, Amara vanished. It began with a message, encrypted, sent to her private phone, appearing on the surface to have come directly from Dae-hyun's own secured line. It contained a private bank transfer already completed, emergency travel documents already issued in her name, a hotel reservation in a city she had never mentioned wanting to visit, and an authorization code, a code that, as far as Amara knew, only Dae-hyun and a small handful of his most senior people were supposed to possess. The message was simple, and it was devastating. It told her that Dae-hyun had chosen his family's empire over her, that she needed to disappear, quietly, before his family discovered the pregnancy and made the problem disappear a far more permanent way. It told her this was, in its own cruel logic, an act of protection. Amara had refused to believe it, at first. She had tried calling him. The calls went unanswered, routed, unbeknownst to her, through channels that were never meant to reach him at all. She had tried messaging him directly, pouring her fear and confusion and heartbreak into text after text, never knowing that every single one of those messages was being intercepted before it ever reached his phone. Then the evidence began arriving. A bank account, opened in her name, with money already inside it. Money she never asked for and instantly recognized as hush money, a payoff, the kind of transaction that only made sense if Dae-hyun wanted her gone and was willing to pay handsomely to make sure she stayed gone. A private vehicle arrived outside her apartment. The driver, a man in a suit with the Seo family crest stitched discreetly into his lapel, told her, not unkindly, that Dae-hyun wanted her gone before his family found out about the child. "He asked me to make sure you're comfortable," the driver had said. "Wherever you decide to go." It was the word comfortable that broke her. Not cruel. Not desperate. Comfortable, the word of a man managing an inconvenience, not a man losing the woman he loved. Amara had sat in her apartment that night, staring at a bank balance that represented, in her mind, the precise dollar value Dae-hyun had assigned to erasing her from his life, and she had made a decision that would define the next 7 months of both their lives. She left. Not because she wanted to. Because every single piece of evidence in front of her told her, with devastating consistency, that staying meant humiliating herself in front of a man who had already decided she wasn't worth keeping. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 4 floors above the apartment she was packing up in a frantic, tear-streaked hurry, Dae-hyun Seo was waking up alone in his own home, reaching for his phone out of habit to send her the good morning message he sent every single day, and finding, instead, a silence that would take him 7 months and an entire unraveling conspiracy to even begin to understand. By the time he realized she was gone, the evidence trail was already immaculate. Her travel documents, apparently self-arranged. The financial transfer, apparently accepted willingly. Security footage from her apartment building showing her leaving of her own accord, dragging 2 suitcases, not looking back. Messages on her phone, messages his own investigators eventually recovered, months later, that appeared to show her telling a friend she wanted nothing more to do with him. Every piece of it lied beautifully. Every piece of it was constructed with a precision that took Dae-hyun weeks to even begin questioning, because who, he kept asking himself, would go to such extraordinary lengths simply to convince 2 people who loved each other that the other had never loved them at all? It was only in the 3rd month of searching, after private investigators, after quiet inquiries to contacts in 4 different countries, after nights spent staring at flight manifests and financial records until his eyes burned, that Dae-hyun finally sat alone in his office at 2 in the morning and allowed himself to say the sentence out loud, to no one, into an empty room. "Someone did this to us on purpose." Not a breakup. Not a woman who simply changed her mind and ran. A construction. An architecture of lies so detailed, so specific, so perfectly aimed at the exact insecurities both of them carried, that it could only have been built by someone who knew them both intimately, someone inside the walls Dae-hyun had thought were impenetrable. That was the night he found the photograph on his desk. He had not put it there. His staff swore, every one of them, under increasingly intense questioning, that they had not put it there either. It simply appeared, a single photograph, printed, no digital trace, showing Amara climbing into the unmarked car outside her apartment building on the night she vanished. On the back, in handwriting that belonged to no one Dae-hyun's forensic team could identify, was a single line. "You were never supposed to find her." Dae-hyun had stood in his office at 2 in the morning, holding that photograph, and understood, for the first time with real, bone-deep certainty, that whatever had happened to Amara was not an accident, was not a misunderstanding, was not even, strictly speaking, about the two of them at all. It was about something bigger. Something that had been set in motion long before either of them understood they were part of it. Back in the present, in the sterile quiet of a private hospital wing overlooking the Han River, Amara lay in a bed with monitors humming softly beside her, tracking a heartbeat that was not her own. Dae-hyun sat in the chair beside her, close enough to reach her hand, far enough that she hadn't asked him to leave. "The doctor says everything looks stable for now," Amara said quietly, staring at the ceiling rather than at him. "But she wants to monitor me closely. There were some complications a few weeks ago. Elevated blood pressure. Some bleeding they couldn't fully explain." "Why didn't you go somewhere else?" Dae-hyun asked. "Anywhere but here." "Because the specialist I need for this specific condition works 3 floors above us," Amara said, a bitter half-smile touching her lips. "Turns out the universe has a sense of humor. Out of every hospital in every city in the world, the one doctor who could actually help my daughter happens to work in the one city I swore I'd never set foot in again." "Your daughter," Dae-hyun repeated softly, something breaking open in his chest at the words. "It's a girl." Amara's guard slipped, just slightly, just for a moment, a flicker of the softness he remembered, quickly buried again. "Yes." For a while, neither of them spoke. Rain tapped gently against the window, and somewhere down the hallway a nurse's cart rattled past, wheels squeaking against polished tile. "I need you to understand something," Dae-hyun finally said, breaking the silence. "I searched for you. Every single day for 7 months. I hired investigators in 4 countries. I flew to Lagos 3 separate times myself, walked streets you might have walked, sat outside hospitals you might have gone to, because I would not, accept that you had simply left." Amara turned her head slightly, studying his face with an expression he couldn't quite read. "I know," she said quietly. Dae-hyun's entire body went still. "What do you mean, you know?" "I mean I know you searched for me." Amara's voice trembled now, the careful control finally starting to crack. "For 7 months, someone sent me photographs. Of you. At airports. Outside hospitals. On streets in Lagos I'd only told 2 people I might visit. Every single photograph came with a message." "What message?" Amara closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were wet. "He wants you found because he wants the child. Not you. The child." Dae-hyun felt the floor tilt beneath him for the second time that day. "That's not true. Amara, that has never been true." "I know that now," she whispered. "I think I've known it for a while, if I'm honest with myself. But when you're alone in a foreign city with a photograph of the man you loved searching every hospital in a 5-mile radius, and someone is whispering in your ear that he only wants what's growing inside you, it does something to a person. It rewires how you read every single piece of evidence in front of you." "Who sent you those photographs?" Dae-hyun's voice had gone low, dangerous, the businessman's calm cracking to reveal something harder underneath. "Amara." "Who?" She reached into the small bag beside her hospital bed with trembling hands and pulled out a worn envelope, its edges soft from months of handling. She held it for a long moment before finally passing it to him. "I kept one," she said. "I don't know why. Maybe some part of me needed proof later that I wasn't imagining any of this." Dae-hyun opened the envelope with hands that had suddenly gone unsteady. Inside was a single photograph, himself, standing outside a hospital in Lagos he barely remembered visiting, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. And behind him, half turned away from the camera but unmistakable to anyone who had known her his whole life, stood a woman he trusted more than almost anyone else on earth. His aunt, Seo Miran. The woman who had raised him after his parents died. The woman who had told him, 1,000 times over 3 decades, "I protected you when nobody else did." The woman he had never once, in 34 years, thought to question. The photograph fell from his fingers and landed softly on the hospital bedsheet, and for the first time since the airport, Dae-hyun Seo did not know what to say at all. "Say something," Amara whispered. "I don't." He shook his head slowly, as if trying to physically dislodge the thought. "Miran raised me. After my parents died, she was the one who sat with me every night for a year so I wouldn't have to be alone in that house. She taught me how to read a balance sheet before I was 12. She sat beside my hospital bed the year I had pneumonia and didn't leave the building for 6 days. His voice cracked. She is the only mother I have ever known. I'm not telling you she doesn't love you, Amara said gently, some of her armor finally slipping in the face of his obvious pain. I'm telling you that whoever she was following you for, whoever she was reporting back to, that person has been controlling both of our lives for 7 months, and I need you to find out who that is before I bring my daughter into this world. Dae-hyun picked the photograph back up, staring at it as though it might rearrange itself into a version of the truth he could bear to accept. I'll talk to her. Not yet. Amara's hand found his wrist, surprising them both with the sudden contact. If you go to her now, half-formed, with nothing but a photograph, she will have an explanation ready. Before you finish your first sentence. She has had 30 years to learn how to manage you. You need more before you walk into that room. He looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes. You've thought about this already. Carefully. I've had 7 months to think about very little else, Amara said. Do you understand yet, Dae-hyun? I didn't run because I was weak. I ran because I didn't know who inside your world I could trust, and the only way to find out was to disappear completely and watch, from a distance, who came looking, and who didn't. Something in the way she said it made him go very still. What do you mean, who came looking? Amara hesitated, and for a moment it looked as though she might say more, as though something larger, something she had been carrying alone for 7 months, was pressing right up against the back of her teeth. Then a monitor beside her bed let out a soft, insistent beep, and a nurse pushed through the door with brisk efficiency, checking readings, adjusting in 4-line, filling the room with a kind of clinical noise that made continuing the conversation impossible. By the time the nurse left, the moment had passed. Amara's eyes had gone distant again, guarded, the door she had briefly opened swinging quietly shut. Get some rest, Dae-hyun said instead, standing reluctantly, every instinct in him screaming to stay. I'll be right outside. And Amara, he paused at the door, looking back at her. Whatever this is, whoever did this to us, I promise you, I am not stopping until I understand every piece of it. She didn't answer. But she didn't tell him to leave either, and for the first time in 7 months, that felt like something. Outside her room, in the hallway lit by the pale blue glow of emergency signage, Dae-hyun pulled out his phone and called Kwon Tae-min, his lieutenant of 14 years, the man who had stood beside him through 2 assassination attempts, who knew every security protocol the Seo family had ever built, who had a security clearance high enough to touch nearly every private system Dae-hyun's family controlled. Tae-min answered on the second ring. Sir. I heard she landed. Is everything? I need everything we have, Dae-hyun said, cutting him off, his voice low and hard in a way Tae-min had rarely heard it in 14 years of service. Every flight manifest, every financial transfer, every security log from the night Amara disappeared. I want to know exactly who accessed my authorization codes that week. All of it, on my desk, within the hour. There was a pause on the other end of the line, brief, almost imperceptible, the kind of hesitation that meant nothing to a stranger and everything to a man who had spent 14 years learning to read every fractional silence in his most trusted lieutenant's voice. Of course, sir, Tae-min said finally. I'll have it ready. Dae-hyun ended the call and stood alone in the hallway, staring through the small window in Amara's door at the woman sleeping restlessly inside, one hand still resting protectively over her stomach even in sleep. Somewhere in this city, someone had spent 7 months building a lie precise enough to convince 2 people who loved each other that neither of them had ever been loved at all. Somewhere in this city, his own aunt had watched him search hospital corridors for the woman she had helped disappear, and said nothing. And somewhere, closer than he wanted to imagine, closer than 14 years of trust should have allowed, someone with access to his most private codes had made a choice, 7 months ago, that was about to detonate everything Dae-hyun Seo had ever believed about the people closest to him. He had no idea, standing in that hallway with rain still streaking the windows behind him, that the hesitation in Tae-min's voice was the first thread of a much larger unraveling, one that would lead him, within hours, to a confession that would break something in him far deeper than heartbreak ever had. Because the truth Amara had not yet told him, the truth she was still deciding whether he had earned the right to hear, was that the photograph of Miran was not the only evidence she had carried back to Seoul. It was only the first. Tae-min arrived at the Seo residence 40 minutes later, a leather folder tucked under one arm, his face carefully arranged into the same calm, professional expression he had worn for 14 years of service. But Dae-hyun had learned, over 14 years, to read the small things. The way Tae-min's grip on the folder was half a second too tight, the way his eyes moved to the exits before they moved to Dae-hyun's face. "Sit down," Dae-hyun said, and it wasn't a request. Taemin sat. He placed the folder on the table between them, but didn't open it, his hand resting flat on top of it as though he could hold the truth inside a little longer by physically pinning it down. "I want to ask you something," Dae-hyun said, "and I want you to understand that I already know part of the answer. I am giving you the chance to tell me the rest yourself, because you have earned that much from me. But only once." Taemin said nothing. 7 months ago, Dae-hyun continued, his voice low and even, someone used my private authorization code to arrange Amara's relocation. Someone with access to systems that only 6 people on this earth are supposed to touch. You are one of those 6 people, Taemin. You have been for 14 years. Still, Taemin said nothing, but his hand had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble against the folder. "I found calls," Dae-hyun said, "to a private relocation company. Consulting payments that don't match any project we've ever run. Encrypted messages sent from a device that pinged a tower 2 blocks from Amara's old apartment on the night she disappeared. I found surveillance photographs, Taemin, of her, taken by someone who knew exactly where to stand and exactly when to be there." He leaned forward. "Tell me I'm wrong." For a long moment, Taemin sat frozen, and then, slowly, deliberately, he did something Dae-hyun had never once seen him do in 14 years of service. He rose from his chair and lowered himself to his knees on the floor of Dae-hyun's own living room, head bowed, hands flat against his thighs. "I helped move her," he said quietly. "It's true. All of it is true." The words hit Dae-hyun like a physical blow, and for a moment he had to grip the edge of the table just to steady himself. 14 years, he said, his voice shaking now, all pretense of calm gone. 14 years, Taemin. You stood beside me through 2 attempts on my life. You held my father's hand when he died. And you did this. I didn't do it to hurt you. Taemin's own voice cracked, raw with something that sounded, unmistakably, like guilt that had been eating him alive for 7 months. I swear to you, sir, I believed I was protecting her. I believed I was protecting both of you. Who ordered you? Dae-hyun's hands had curled into fists at his sides. Who gave you that order, Taemin? Silence. Who? The word tore out of him, louder than he intended, echoing off the high ceilings of a house that had never once heard him raise his voice. Taemin lifted his head, and there were tears in his eyes now, actual tears, the first Dae-hyun had ever seen from a man who had once carried a bullet wound for 6 blocks without making a sound. The order came from someone above me, he said. Someone I could not refuse. Miran, Dae-hyun said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a confirmation of the thing he had already begun to suspect, standing in that hospital hallway, staring at a photograph that shouldn't have existed. But Taemin shook his head, and the answer that came out of him next was somehow worse than the one Dae-hyun had braced for. No. The single word hung in the room like something toxic. Dae-hyun stared at him, feeling the ground he thought he stood on tilt yet again, a 3rd time in a single day, each tilt steeper than the last. Then who, he said, very quietly now, could possibly outrank my own aunt in a family where she has effectively run half our operations since I was 14 years old? Taemin's hands were shaking visibly now. I was told, he said, that Amara's presence would trigger a war inside the family. I was told that moving her, quietly, temporarily, would keep her safe until things had settled. I believed that. I believed I was protecting her from something worse. And then she disappeared completely, and I realized the plan had never been temporary at all. Taemin's voice broke fully now, the composure of 14 years finally giving way. I tried to find out where she'd actually gone. I tried to investigate on my own, quietly, without anyone knowing. And then I received a message. What message? Taemin swallowed hard. It said, if you tell Dae-hyun anything, Amara won't be the only person who disappears. The room went utterly silent. Somewhere outside, rain continued to fall against the windows, and Dae-hyun stood very still, absorbing the shape of what his most trusted friend had just told him, that for 7 months, Taemin had carried this alone, terrified, trapped between loyalty to a man he loved like a brother and a threat that had made silence feel like the only survivable option. Give me something, Dae-hyun finally said. Anything. A name. A direction. Something I can use. Tae-min reached into his jacket with trembling hands and produced a small encrypted drive, holding it out like an offering, like a confession made physical. "I kept this," he said. "I've had it for 7 months. I was afraid to give it to you because I didn't know what it would do to you. I still don't." Dae-hyun took the drive and inserted it into his laptop with hands that had gone unsteady for the first time in longer than he could remember. A single audio file appeared on the screen. He clicked it, and the room filled with a voice he recognized instantly, a voice that had once told him bedtime stories in a house grieving 2 parents, a voice that had steadied him through every crisis of his adult life. Except it wasn't speaking to him. "If anything happens to me," Amara's recorded voice said, quiet and urgent, clearly speaking to someone else entirely, someone whose responses had not been captured, "don't let Dae-hyun know about the second file. Not yet. Not until we know who's really behind this." Dae-hyun stopped the recording, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What second file?" Tae-min looked at him, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something like genuine fear crossed his face. Not fear of Dae-hyun, but fear of what came next. "That's the problem, sir," he said quietly. "I don't know. But I believe there are 2 conspiracies running at once. One was built to remove Amara from your life. The other—" he hesitated, choosing his next words with visible dread. "The other was built to make you believe you were the one searching for her the whole time, when in reality, someone was using your search itself as a weapon against her." Dae-hyun sat down slowly, the strength suddenly gone from his legs, and stared at the small silver drive in his palm as though it might rearrange itself into an explanation he could survive. He had no way of knowing, sitting there in the wreckage of everything he thought he understood about the people closest to him, that 3 floors up in a hospital room overlooking the Han River, Amara Okafor was awake in the dark, holding a second encrypted drive against her chest, trying to decide, for the 100th time in 7 months, whether the man she had once loved had earned back enough trust to finally see what was on it. She decided the next morning. Dae-hyun arrived at the hospital before sunrise, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and found Amara already sitting up, a tray of untouched hospital food beside her, her eyes fixed on something in her lap that she quickly, almost guiltily, tucked beneath her blanket when he entered. "You look terrible," she said, and there was something almost gentle in it, the first hint of warmth he'd heard from her since the airport. "I had a difficult night," he admitted, sitting heavily in the chair beside her bed. Tae-min confessed. "He helped move you 7 months ago. He was ordered to." Amara's expression didn't shift much. She had clearly already suspected some version of this, but her hands tightened around the edge of her blanket. "Ordered by whom?" "He says it wasn't Miran. He wouldn't tell me more than that. He gave me a recording instead." Dae-hyun's voice dropped, low and unsteady. "Your voice, Amara. Talking to someone about a second file. Telling them not to let me know." Something shifted behind her eyes. Resignation, maybe, or relief. The look of a woman finally setting down a weight she had carried too long alone. "I found something," she said quietly, "before I disappeared. Not after. Before. That's the part one never told you, because I didn't know yet whether you were part of it." "Part of what?" Amara pulled the small object from beneath her blanket, a second encrypted drive, worn smooth at the edges from months of being carried, hidden, protected. 2 weeks before I disappeared," she said, "I found a document in your family's private archive. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for something else entirely. Old photographs, family history, the kind of thing you fall into researching at 3 in the morning when you can't sleep and you're trying to understand the family you're about to marry into." Her voice trembled slightly. "Instead, I found a confidential clause buried in something called the Hanul Crown Trust. A clause about your future biological child. Written years before either of us knew I would ever get pregnant." Dae-hyun stared at her. "That's not possible. I didn't even know that clause existed until after you disappeared." "I know," Amara said. "That's what terrified me. Because attached to that old clause was a note, recent, dated only weeks before I found it. It said, if the Nigerian woman becomes pregnant, initiate contingency." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Someone had been watching us long before I ever missed a period, Dae-hyun. Someone had a plan ready and waiting for exactly this moment, and I was the trigger they'd been anticipating." The room felt suddenly very small. Dae-hyun sat frozen, trying to make sense of a timeline that defied every explanation he could construct. So you copied it, he said slowly. The document. I copied it, and then I built a second file, everything I could find about the contingency plan, every name I could connect to it, every date that didn't add up. And then I made a decision I've never fully forgiven myself for. Amara's voice cracked. I let myself disappear. I didn't fight the lie they built around me nearly as hard as I could have, because some part of me realized that disappearing completely, and staying gone, was the only way I'd ever find out who was really behind it, without giving away that I knew anything at all. Dae-hyun felt something twist painfully in his chest. Not anger, not quite. Something closer to awe, tangled hopelessly with heartbreak. You spent 7 months investigating a conspiracy against your own child. Alone. While the entire world, including me, believed you'd simply run away. I didn't know who to trust, Amara whispered. Not even you. Especially not you at first, because whoever built that clause had access to information deep inside your family's private records. That kind of access doesn't come cheap, and it doesn't come from strangers. Show me, Dae-hyun said. Whatever's on that drive. All of it. I need to see. Amara hesitated one final moment, and then, with hands that trembled only slightly, she opened her laptop and inserted the drive. The first file was the document itself, dense, legal, dated decades earlier, establishing the succession structure of the Hanul Crown Trust that governed nearly everything Dae-hyun's family controlled. Buried in a clause near the end was the provision Amara had described. Recognition of a legitimate biological heir would prevent certain voting rights from consolidating under the Seven-Family Council. And beneath it, in handwriting Dae-hyun didn't recognize, the recent addition that had haunted Amara for 7 months. The second file was an audio recording. Amara's finger hovered over it for a moment before she finally pressed play, and a man's voice filled the hospital room, measured, cold, utterly certain of itself. Once the child is born, Dae-hyun will lose everything. Dae-hyun's blood went cold. He knew that voice. He had heard it in boardrooms his entire adult life, had been raised, in some sense, to respect and fear it in equal measure. That's... His mouth had gone dry. That's Chairman Han Jae-suk's voice. I know, Amara said quietly. I recognized it too. Which is what makes this so impossible. He's dead, Dae-hyun said. He died 3 years ago. I attended the funeral myself. They stared at each other, the recording still playing softly in the background, a dead man's voice issuing orders about a child who hadn't existed when he supposedly gave them. It took Dae-hyun's forensic team 11 hours to determine the truth of the recording, 11 hours during which he barely left Amara's hospital room, barely spoke, staring at his phone as though sheer force of will could make the analysis complete faster. When the answer finally came, delivered by a nervous technician who clearly understood the weight of what he was reporting, it explained everything and nothing at once. The recording was assembled, pieced together, with unsettling precision, from archived speeches, private board recordings, even old family gatherings, stitched into new sentences the chairman had never actually spoken. Someone had built a ghost. Someone had taken a dead man's voice and given it new orders, new authority, using it to direct an operation from beyond the grave in a way that made the true architect nearly impossible to trace. Someone wanted it to look like Han Jae-suk never really died, Dae-hyun said slowly, sitting across from Miran in her private study that evening, the photograph Amara had given him placed deliberately on the table between them. Or wanted it to look like his authority never really ended. Miran's eyes moved to the photograph, and for the first time in Dae-hyun's entire life, he watched something crack behind the composed, unshakable face of the woman who had raised him. "Where did you get that?" she asked quietly. "Does it matter?" Dae-hyun's voice was hard now, stripped of the softness he usually reserved for her. "You were following me, Miran. 4 months. While I searched every hospital and airport in this city for a woman you knew exactly where to find." She said nothing for a long moment, her composure visibly fighting against something underneath. Then, quietly, she said, "I ordered Taemin to move her." The confession landed exactly as heavily as he'd expected, and yet somehow still managed to steal the breath from his lungs. "I did it to protect her," Miran continued, her voice steady now, rehearsed, the voice of a woman who had prepared this defense for a long time. "The Seven-Family Council would have killed her, Dae-hyun, if they'd known about the pregnancy before we could control the narrative. I moved her to keep her alive." "Then why," Dae-hyun said, each word deliberate, dangerous, "did you make her believe I had abandoned her?" Why send her photographs of me searching, twisted into proof that I only wanted the child and never her? Because if she knew you were looking for her honestly, Miran said, the council would have found her through you. I needed her to stay hidden, completely, and the only way to guarantee that was to make sure she never trusted you enough to reach out. For one terrible moment, it almost made sense. It was almost horribly believable, a version of protection twisted so far it became indistinguishable from cruelty, but protection nonetheless. Dae-hyun felt himself wanting to believe it, wanting, desperately, for the woman who raised him to still be the person he'd always trusted. Then the study door opened, and Amara stood in the frame, still moving slowly, one hand braced against the doorway, having insisted on discharging herself from observation the moment she heard where Dae-hyun had gone. "She's lying," Amara said. Both of them turned. Miran's composure faltered fully now, genuine alarm flickering across her face for the first time. "I found the document 2 weeks before I disappeared," Amara said, stepping into the room, her voice growing stronger with every word. "The contingency clause was written months before I ever missed a period, Miran. Which means whoever built that plan wasn't reacting to protect me from a threat that already existed. They were preparing, in advance, for a threat they expected to create." Miran's mouth opened, then closed. "You didn't discover a conspiracy and try to manage it," Amara continued, each word landing like a verdict. "You were part of building it from the very beginning. The only thing you didn't plan for was me finding the paperwork before I disappeared." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Dae-hyun had ever heard in his life. "It wasn't me who created the original plan," Miran finally said, very quietly, all pretense finally abandoned. "I discovered it. I tried to manage it, tried to control the damage, tried to keep both of you alive inside something I did not build and could not fully stop." Her eyes filled with tears that looked, for the first time, entirely genuine. "The people who created it are far more powerful than I am, Dae-hyun. And far more dangerous than you understand." "Who?" Dae-hyun said, his voice a low, controlled fury that frightened even himself. "Who created it?" Miran looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face, something exhausted, something almost relieved to finally stop carrying the weight alone, seemed to make the decision for her. "They call themselves the Custodians," she said. "A committee hidden inside the Seven Family Council. Their goal was never simply to take your holdings, Dae-hyun. It was to make sure your bloodline never merged with hers." She glanced at Amara. "Because if it did, your daughter wouldn't just be your heir. She would be the one person alive capable of reuniting two ownership claims that were deliberately separated generations ago, claims that, combined, could unravel the entire structure the custodians have spent decades protecting." Amara's hand went instinctively to her stomach. "My family," she whispered. "My grandfather." "Your family's connection to the original founders of the trust isn't incidental," Miran said. "It never was. Someone has been watching both of your bloodlines for far longer than either of you have been alive." Miran left the study that night without another word, and Dae-hyun sat alone for a long time afterward, staring at the space where the woman who raised him had been standing only minutes before. Amara lowered herself carefully into the chair across from him, her hand finding his across the table, and for a while neither of them spoke, both still absorbing the size of what they had just uncovered. "I keep waiting to feel something simple," Dae-hyun finally said. "Anger, maybe. Or relief that it isn't entirely her fault. But it just feels like standing at the edge of something much bigger than I can see the bottom of." "That's because it is," Amara said quietly. "This isn't about one betrayal, Dae-hyun. It never was. It's decades old. It started before either of us was born, and I don't think we've found the center of it yet. Then we keep going," he said, "together this time. No more secrets, no more second files hidden until one of us decides the other has earned the truth." Amara studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Not quite doubt, not quite trust, something suspended carefully between the two. "I want to believe that," she said. "I do. But I spent 7 months learning that the people closest to us are exactly the ones capable of building the most convincing lies. I'm not ready to hand over blind faith again. Not even to you." "Then don't," Dae-hyun said. "Just let me earn it back, one true thing at a time." It was the most honest thing either of them had said to each other since the airport, and something about its simplicity seemed to loosen a knot that had been sitting in Amara's chest for months. She didn't answer with words. She only tightened her hand around his, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that plane, it felt less like two survivors negotiating a truce and more like two people quietly finding their way back to each other. The final piece arrived 2 days later, delivered not by Miran, and not by Taemin, but by the one person nobody in the room had thought to fully suspect. Yoon Harin arrived at Dae-hyun's office alone, without an appointment, without her family's usual entourage of advisors and image consultants, carrying a small recorder and an expression of quiet, controlled fury that Dae-hyun had never once seen on her carefully composed face in the 2 years their families had been arranging their marriage. "I need you to listen to something," she said, setting the recorder on his desk without preamble. "Before you decide what to think of me." The recording that played was of her own father, speaking to men whose voices Dae-hyun didn't recognize, discussing her marriage to Dae-hyun not as a union but as an instrument, a legal bridge into his holdings, a controlled asset to be deployed at the moment the council's restructuring required it. "I only found out 3 weeks ago," Harin said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion, when the recording ended, "that my entire engagement was never about stability. It was never about our families. I was recruited, Dae-hyun, groomed for this from the moment my father realized what your future child could threaten." She looked at him directly, something fierce and wounded in her eyes. "I am not your enemy. I have spent 3 weeks secretly recording every meeting I could access, because I refuse to be used as a weapon against a family that never did anything to me." She handed him a final folder, evidence, meticulously organized, connecting names, dates, and payments in a way that finally gave the conspiracy a shape solid enough to fight. "Your child isn't the threat they're afraid of," Harin said quietly, standing to leave. "It's what she proves. That's what actually terrifies them." The days that followed moved fast and slow at once. Fast in the way a countdown always feels once it's finally visible, slow in the way exhaustion stretches every hour into something heavier than it should be. Dae-hyun barely slept. He split his time between Amara's bedside and war rooms full of lawyers poring over the Hanul Crown Trust line by line, searching for every clause the custodians might try to exploit before the 6-day window closed. Twice, Amara woke in the middle of the night to find him asleep upright in the chair beside her bed, still in the suit he'd worn to the office, his hand resting protectively on the arm of the chair as though even unconscious he refused to be more than a few feet from her. "You don't have to do this," she told him once, half asleep herself. "The lawyers can handle the filings without you standing over every page." "I know," he said. "I'm not here for the filings." Amara went into labor 4 days early, in the middle of the night, 6 days before the council's restructuring was set to finalize, the exact window the custodians had been counting on to complete their transfer before any child could be legally recognized. The hospital went into a quiet, controlled lockdown as Dae-hyun's legal team scrambled to file the evidence Harin had provided, racing against a clock that had never once cared about timing with any mercy. "If you stay here," one of his senior advisors told him bluntly, standing in the hallway outside the delivery room, "you lose the window to personally oversee the counterfiling. You could lose direct control of the empire tonight, Dae-hyun." Dae-hyun didn't hesitate. "Then let them take it." He walked into the delivery room and stayed there for 6 hours, holding Amara's hand through every part of it, and when their daughter finally arrived, small, furious, impossibly alive, Amara held her first, tears streaming freely down her face, before finally looking up at him. "You promised she would never wonder whether you wanted her," she said, her voice raw and exhausted and full of something that had, somewhere in the last few days, become dangerously close to trust again. "I want both of you," Dae-hyun said, his own voice breaking completely for the first time since the airport. "Everything else can burn." Amara placed their daughter in his arms, and for one long, suspended moment, none of it mattered. Not the empire, not the custodians, not 7 months of manufactured heartbreak. There was only a small, warm weight against his chest, and the woman beside him watching him hold her with an expression that looked, finally, almost like peace. They named her Nari. A lily, something capable of growing through difficult ground without ever letting that ground harden her. Weeks later, the empire had been quietly restructured. The council's takeover had collapsed under the weight of Harin's evidence, several allied families turning against the custodians once the manipulation became impossible to deny. Miran's role in the conspiracy became public within their family, if not beyond it, and Dae-hyun, rather than punishing her outright, chose instead to dismantle the very structure that had allowed a decades-old committee to manipulate 3 generations of his family from the shadows. "Did you ever love me?" he asked her, the last time they spoke as anything resembling family. "Yes," Miran said, "and for once there was no performance in it at all. I watched your father destroy himself chasing a love the family considered inconvenient, and I promised myself I would never let you make the same mistake. I thought controlling your future was the same thing as protecting it." "You didn't protect me from his mistake," Dae-hyun said quietly. "You nearly made me repeat it in a far crueler way." He walked away from that conversation lighter, somehow, than he had felt in years. The empire diminished, the secrecy that had once defined his family stripped back layer by layer. And none of it, in the end, mattered nearly as much as the small apartment across the city where Amara was packing slowly, deliberately, preparing to take their daughter home. "Are you leaving?" he asked, standing in her doorway, watching her fold a tiny blanket into a suitcase. "I'm going home," she said, and then, catching the flicker of disappointment crossing his face before he could hide it, she smiled, the first full, unguarded smile he'd seen from her since before any of this began. "You can come with us. If you want." He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, and crossed the room to hold both of them at once. "7 months ago," he murmured against her hair, "I thought I'd lost you completely." "You didn't lose me," Amara said softly, looking down at their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. "We were both being kept from each other. Deliberately. By people who understood exactly what we meant to each other before we fully did." "By whom?" he asked. "All of them. The custodians, Miran, everyone." Amara was quiet for a moment too long, her eyes drifting, almost involuntarily, toward a drawer across the room. One Dae-hyun hadn't noticed until just now, one she seemed to be deciding, in real time, whether to open at all. "That," she finally said, "is what the next file is for." Dae-hyun's smile faded slowly from his face. "Next file." Amara looked at him for a long, unreadable moment, the warmth still present in her eyes, but joined now by something wary, something that had never fully left her since the night she'd found that first document in a family archive she wasn't supposed to be searching. She didn't answer him directly. She only looked toward the drawer once more, and then back at their sleeping daughter, and said nothing at all, leaving the question hanging in the quiet apartment like a held breath neither of them was ready to release. Somewhere across the city, in a room neither of them would ever be able to trace, a laptop screen glowed in the dark. An old photograph filled the display. 2 men standing together decades ago outside a modest home in Lagos, one of them unmistakably a younger version of Dae-hyun's grandfather, the other a man whose features, faded by time, bore an unmistakable resemblance to the family Amara had grown up believing was simply her own. Beneath the photograph, 3 words appeared on the screen, glowing pale against the darkness. Project Bloodline. And beneath that, a status update, freshly logged, time-stamped to the very hour of Nari's birth. Successor born. A final line appeared a moment later, quiet and absolute, closing one chapter of a plan that had clearly never intended to end where everyone in that sole apartment believed it had. Phase 2. Activated. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to the end. It genuinely means so much to me. If any part of it stayed with you, I'd love it if you hit that subscribe button, and please, drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one, and they truly make my day. I'm also always curious where you're all tuning in from, so let me know what city or country you're watching this from tonight. Until the next one, take care of yourselves, and stay safe out there.